Good morning and welcome to the Edge of Reason. I have now with me William Detmer, Bill Detmer, author of The Logical Thinking Process. And I want to talk to him about how he got into this and all of that. So, hi, Bill. Welcome.
Hello there, Thorsteinn. How are you?
I'm just fine, thanks.
I'm pleased to be with you today.
Very good. So let me just ask you, Bill, first, because now you've been sort of the world expert in the logical thinking process for a long time. And what I would be interested in discussing with you a bit is how you got into this. As we know, the logical thinking process, it builds on certain methodologies from the theory of constraints.
Right.
So how did you get to get involved in all this?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I have to say that where I am now professionally in my life is not where I thought I would be 30 years ago. And it was not what I thought I would be doing when I first found out about the theory of constraints. Let's just go back to the beginning. I concluded a 23-year career in the United States Air Force in 1988, and I had no real sense for what I wanted to do after I retired from the Air Force because I was too young to fully retire, and I had two young kids that I had to put through school. So I started looking for employment, and in the meantime, I began teaching graduate courses in systems management for the University of Southern California's Institute of Safety and Systems Management. This was the only real systems management program in the country at the time. I taught those courses for about 7 years as a part-time thing while I was basically looking for full-time employment someplace. During the course of that process, I became fast friends with another professor, also an adjunct part-timer, by the name of Mel Anderson. And not coincidentally, he was also a retired Air Force pilot like myself. So we had a lot in common. I had the unusual experience, if you will, of following Mel into various different remote study centers. At that time, the university had about 15 or 20 study centers around the world and throughout the United States and parts of Europe, most of them located at military bases. And so they would assign professors to teach a term of about 6 weeks at each location. And Mel and I seemed to be on a schedule where I would follow him the term after he taught at a particular location. And since I had never been to most of these places, it was worthwhile for me to talk to him on the phone about what the place was like, what the students were like, the faculty apartment, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, do some reconnaissance ahead of time. Mel and I hit it off really well. And one day when I called him to find out what it was like at one of these study centers, he said, well, I'm going to this presentation by a guy named Goldratt. And I said, okay, that's interesting, but I'm thinking to myself, big deal, And where he was at the time was teaching a course up in Seattle, and he was invited by his students to come out to Boeing, to the big conference hall that they had there at Boeing, and that's where Goldratt was going to be holding forth for an hour or two. And when he came away from that, he was mightily impressed. And he said, I am going to go to this Goldratt Institute in Connecticut for a 2-week course. and basically in manufacturing production control. And I said, okay, I was still not terribly stirred by that. I said, let me know how it goes. Well, at the end of the next 6-week term, I coordinated with him again. And I said, by the way, how did that trip to Connecticut work out for you? Well, he just couldn't stop talking about it. He said it was great. And he said, I'm going back there again to go to the advanced course, which is how to teach this stuff, because he wanted to fold it into his classes that he was teaching for the university too. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. But I still didn't think too much of it. Well, then the term after that, my boss called me and said, I need your help on an emergency here. Harold Sherman, one of the senior professors at the institute, is retiring, and he was scheduled to teach a course in Santa Barbara, and I need for you to pick up that course. And I said, well, what was the course? And he told me what the name of the course was. And I said, hey, you know, I really don't have any experience in that. And he said, that's okay. I'll send you the course syllabus and I'll send you the books, and you just stay 3 weeks ahead of the students and you'll be fine. And I thought, oh my God. I wondered, how much does this go on in university? How often does this happen? And so I went ahead and I looked at the course syllabus, and I looked at the books that were there, and one of them was a book that went very much along the lines of the material that the course was covering, but there was a secondary text, and it was The Gold by Eliyahu Goldratt.
All right. Yeah.
And I said, oh, this is the guy that Mel told me about and has been raving about. And I said, okay, I guess I'm going to have to read this and see what the hell's going on. Well, I did. I read it and I got the fever just like everybody else did. And so I started trying to figure out how this was going to work out. To make a long story short, my boss, the director of the institute, agreed to send me to the 2-week course in Connecticut. And this was going to take place the first week in February of 1993. And I was going to go there to learn how to do manufacturing production control the Goldratt way. And I ended up going there for 2 weeks, but imagine my surprise when I showed up for the first day, and the instructor said, this course is about the thinking processes. And I said, what? I came there to learn about drum buffer rope, and all of a sudden they're talking about these logic diagrams, and I couldn't figure out what had happened. Well, what had happened was, I won't go into the history of why Goldratt developed the logical thinking process, but in this latter half of 1992, he resolved to make the thinking processes the focus of his so-called Jonah course, which before that had been purely about production control.
Yeah, it had been going on for a while then. How long since he started with the drum buffer rope at that time?
He had been doing that, I'm going to say, formally since about 1987. He started originally, he formed a company with his brother, and I don't know, I think there might have been another partner in there. The company was called Creative Output. And Creative Output was a company that was designed to smooth production flow. They came to America, they developed it in Israel, but they brought it to America because the US was a much larger market. For one reason or another, and I don't want to go into it, I know what the reasons are, but it's too complicated at this point. He decided he needed to train people in the principles of drum buffer rope. not just install the software, show him how to operate it and let him go. So he figured I need to be selling some training along with this. Well, his financial partners, the backers of his company, weren't happy about that. And they told him, forget about all that training stuff, just sell the software. And Goldratt never took instruction from anybody very well. But to his credit too, because let's face it, had he done what other people wanted him to do, we never would have had the theory of constraints.
No,
But long story short, in 1986, the financial investors threw him out of his own company, and creative output collapsed within a year thereafter. In the meantime, Goldratt decided to form the Goldratt Institute, the Avraham Goldratt Institute, based in New Haven, Connecticut. And its goal was basically to teach people the principles of how to do drum buffer rope. And so basically he got into doing that. The thinking process developed when he realized that a lot of the companies out there, especially in the US, were not involved in production control. They were service companies. And so he started trying to solve the problems of service companies, and eventually, as in a process of doing so, developed the concept of the thinking process.
So that was why he developed it. Yeah.
Yes, that was the reason why he developed it, was basically to be able to see the big systemic picture, of which drum buffer rope was a part in production organizations, but it had virtually nothing to do with service organizations, which at that time were about 75% of the US economy.
So, yeah, right. Yeah. So, but when you read the goal, those principles, basically, you see them. You see them being applied by Jonah in the goal. This way of approaching the problems and analyzing them and solving them. So this is it comes from there originally, doesn't it? In a way.
Yes. Yeah, it really does. And the fact of the matter is that, as most people in the TOC community are aware, the book, The Goal, went through a number of revisions and editions and so forth. By the time I got a hold of it in 1992, I was working on the second revised edition. And the first was in 1984 that he started writing it. And then the first edition came out in, I think, 86. And then, so by the time I got my hands on it, I think it was in the third iteration.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So this is basically how you get to know of the thinking processes, which were called by that name at the time, the theory of constraints thinking processes.
Yes.
What happened then? Because now we have the logical thinking process, which is basically it's similar, but it's not precisely the same.
No, you're absolutely right. It's not. Goldratt was in a very exciting period of his life and the development of the Goldratt Institute, as they were expanding their reach into various different areas of industry and economic organizations in the US. He had a lot on his plate at one time, and the thinking process was the newest thing. By that time, drum buffer rope was fairly mature, well-developed, and understood. Thinking process, not so much. So over the course of the next few years, he emphasized the thinking processes. And that's when I basically came on board. And I realized that I couldn't be a master of everything in TOC. And it was the thinking processes that fascinated me. So I said, this is the area where I will choose to specialize.
So what was it about it that fascinated you at the time? Was that related with your systems thinking work? Or?
Absolutely, it was. And in point of fact, I went to the training, the so-called Jonah course, in 1993, expecting to learn production control the Goldratt way. What I found was a systems management tool that was potentially far more expansive and had far more potential in a wider range of organizations than just drum buffer rope. And I said, wow, this is really something. I can recall riding on the airplane back from the East Coast back to the LA area, which is where I lived at the time, and looking around at all of the passengers on the airplane and thinking to myself, man, I know a secret that nobody else on this airplane knows, and it could possibly change the world. And so I was really enthusiastic and excited about it. I like to say I got off that airplane with my hair on fire.
So maybe for those of our in our audience who really don't know very much about the thinking processes or the logical thinking process, would you maybe take a couple of minutes just to tell us what it is about, what's the secret that got your hair on fire?
Well, what got my hair on fire was the fact that the logical connections in the trees that I built when I was learning the process, they tended to get out of a narrow channel of direct linear cause and effect, and they included collateral areas. This appealed to me because of my systems management background and the teaching that I had been doing, because I was well aware that all organizations really are complex organizations that have a lot of moving parts, each of which is intended to do something specific, but it depends on the other parts of the organization.
Right.
So if you're analyzing what looks to be a problem in, say, the production area, the chances are very good that one of the root causes of any problem in that area comes from another area, either the finance or perhaps sales and marketing or supply chain or something like that. And they have collateral impacts on production. Now, production may be the part that you see, the part that's hurting you right now. But as you start digging into cause and effect, you find that the roots of the problem extend many other areas.
Yeah. So what is different then in this approach from what people were doing before to figure out the root causes of problems? What's unique about this?
Well, I think the unique part of the thinking process is that it is a whole system approach, and it begins with the top level of the organization, not the top level, but say the broader picture of the entire organization. And it starts by asking the question, what is the goal of this system? What's it trying to achieve? And then the follow-up question is, in what ways is it not achieving that goal?
Yeah.
And then you start drilling down the cause and effect in each of those areas. And eventually those, what look like maybe separate trees, are really branches of a larger tree that eventually converges into a limited number of I call them critical root causes at the bottom. Now, this is a somewhat different than the approach that Goldratt took with the thinking processes.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I struggled for 10 years almost, let's say 8 years, to teach the logical thinking processes, the thinking processes, I'll say, the way that I was given it from the Goldratt Institute. And I found that it was very difficult for me to wrap my arms around when teaching, and even more so for the students to absorb. And I realized that the reason was that it didn't really have a systemic focus. It covered the system, but not in an orderly way.
Yeah.
And so over the course of the years, well, I wrote my first book on the logical thinking processes in 1996. And I used that as a text for my courses in this. And in point of fact, the book was really written about the logical thinking processes as Goldratt conceived them. But over the next few years, as I realized, there were weak spots that made it more difficult for me to teach and more difficult for students to learn. I started making some changes in what I taught and how I taught. And the biggest one of these was the creation of what became known as the Gold Tree back in about 2002. And I even wrote a book about that for the development of strategy. And that was called Strategic Navigation.
All right.
Originally, I called that tool the Strategic Intermediate Objectives Map, but a colleague later on suggested it's a gold tree. And I thought,
so you started off with the Goldratt tradition of long and opaque names.
Yes.
And
Yes. And then I got into calling it a gold tree. But the fact is that by the time 2004, 2005 came around, I'm now at the point of 9 years since I actively started consulting with this, and 13 years since I actually was teaching it. I was contacted by my publisher, who said, well, how about writing a second edition? You got some updates you want to put in? And I looked at it and I said, no, I don't want to do a second edition. I want to do a complete rewrite. Now, why did I decide this? Well, the original book that I wrote, called Goldratt's Theory of Constraints, when I published it, it was about that thick. And over the course of my 10 years of teaching the thinking processes, I started handing out supplementary materials that added new ways of doing things, new techniques, new examples, and so forth for the students. And I put them in a binder that I would hand out with the book. And these were to basically bring the outdated book up to speed to where it would be usable. By 2005, that binder was thicker than the book. And I said, it's time to rewrite this and fold all of that in. So in 2006, I rewrote the original Goldratt's Theory of Constraints, but with the addition of the gold tree and different approaches to the tools, I decided I got to call it something else because it's not the same. It works on the same principles and the concepts are all Goldratt's, but it's not the same. So I started calling it the logical thinking process, singular, because from a system standpoint, I look at the solution of problems, not as a series of processes, maybe sub-processes, but the overall process is what you get from the three, well, I call them 4 focusing steps. And the first one is why change. The second one is what to change. The third one is what to change to. And the fourth one is how to make the change. And the gold tree actually answers that first question as to why change. So
and it's interesting when you think about it actually, and not least thinking about Goldratt's first book, which is incidentally called The Goal, that in the original processes he didn't really have that focusing, first focusing step.
But he didn't need it because he was totally focused on the manufacturing production process.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And one of the most powerful parts of that, the goal, is after Alex gets the plant on a good drum buffer rope basis, he finds that he's got so much excess capacity that he's got a lot of steps in the process that are idle. And so he says, okay, he goes up to the the head shed says to the sales VP, says, get me more orders. And so that is it's an intuitive switch from an internal constraint to an external constraint.
Right. Yeah.
And that was probably, I think, the most powerful lesson out of the book, is the fact that if you do it right, you're going to move your constraint completely out of your organization and to an area where you don't have much control over it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I should make this one other comment regarding that particular concept, and that is my dear friend and colleague, Ellie Schragenheim, from whom I learned more about drum buffer rope and how it works than any other place. He pointed out to me that the ideal situation for a company is to keep the organizational system on the ragged edge of the boundary of the organization, so that I didn't say that right. What I meant is, I meant to say to keep the constraint on the ragged edge of just barely going out, not even going outside the system boundary, but you push it to the edge so that you keep it inside the organization, but at its maximum productivity, so that you don't push it out where you have no control. You keep it inside where you do have control, but you maximize it. And as time goes on, you make little changes, the constraint will go outside. And then you take some action to try to pull it back in again where you have control over it. And then it becomes sort of an oscillation. And that was right. A very powerful lesson to me too.
Yeah. So through this this whole process of learning and writing and so on, I guess you've got to know Goldratt quite well.
Yes, as a matter of fact, that was kind of an interesting thing, the way that developed. I came back from my first experience at the Goldratt Institute in '93. As I said, I got off the airplane with my hair on fire. I was ready to run back into my graduate classes and start teaching the thinking process. The difficulty was that in an academic environment, you have to have some sort of reading material, which typically is a textbook. There was no textbook at the time. There were just the checklists for building the trees with no explanation for the steps or why you're doing them. And it's okay for somebody who spent 10 intensive days going through and interacting with an instructor and understanding this. But for a student in a university, they got to have something they can read first. Didn't exist. So over the course of the next year or two, I started writing all the rationale behind the steps and the steps themselves and building examples. And I was fortunate that the University of Southern California's bookstore had a print shop. And this print shop would print collections of materials that the instructors would say, they'd take a chapter out of one book and then a part of a chapter out of another book and a published paper, and they'd roll them all into a single, what they referred to as a course reader. And the students would purchase those along with the normal textbook to get the additional material the instructor wanted. So I went ahead and I said, I'm going to put together something along those lines. And I did. And the interesting thing is, by the time I got everything on paper with all of the diagrams, that course reader was about 1 inch thick.
All right.
And the university bookstore carried it. And I made it a supplementary required reading for all of the courses that I took, because I would devote some class time in every course to teaching logical thinking. And so one day I get a telephone call from the bookstore, and he said, the manager said, we just got a call for an order for your textbook or your course reader. And I said, I'm not teaching next term. Why would you get that? Oh, it didn't come from a student in the university. it came from outside the university. And I said, really? Where did it come from? He said, it came from the Boeing Library in Seattle. They want 30 copies. And they said, should we sell them? And I said, sure, why not? So they did. And then over the course of the next 6 months or so, the bookstore would sell more and more of these until by about early 1995, they had 450 of these copies sold outside the university to various different corporations and people. And that's when I figured, well, it's time to write the book commercially, because the bookstore isn't going to do this forever. That's not their job. So that's where I started writing the book. And of course, I started with the trees that I built in learning the thinking process at the Goldratt Institute.
Right.
And so that's how I got into the publication business. I decided, but the thing of it is, I didn't know how to get published. It happened that Goldratt was on a speaking tour of the U.S. In 1994. I think it was. Yeah, I think it was November of '94. He was out in Los Angeles at the Beverly Wilshire Theater in Beverly Hills. And I was teaching that term in Orange County. And he was going to be there on a night when I should have been teaching class. So a week ahead of time, I told all the students, no class next Wednesday night. But if you want some extra credit and you're willing to make the trip, come on up to the Beverly Wilshire Theater and listen to this guy. And about half the class showed up. And I brought at that time, my course reader was a fairly thick notebook, loose leaf notebook. And so I brought a copy of that along that I printed out on my computer, and I 3-hole punched it. And I met Goldratt in the lobby of the theater before the performance started, and introduced myself. And I gave him the book, or the binder, and I said to him, I think you might be interested in this. This is the book I wrote on how to build the logic trees. And his eyebrows went up, because this was a complete surprise to him. And he said, I'll read it on my trip. And he did. And I didn't hear from him for, I don't remember how long. It was some time. And then I got a telephone call from him in I think he was in New Haven at the time. Yeah. And he said, I'm sitting here in my office with Larry Gadd, who was his publisher, North River Press, and we're talking about your book. And he said, I think there's a lot of good in that book, but he said, I think it needs to be rewritten. And I'm rolling my eyes back, saying thinking, man, it took me forever to get this down. He wants me to rewrite it. He said to me, I want you to come to Israel and we'll talk about this and other things. And I said, okay. I said, you should know that I don't have the resources to be able to go to Israel right now. And he said, not to worry, we'll take care of that. Well, what he did was he got Larry Gadd to pay for my trip both directions, on the promise that Gadd would get the book, the binder, to publish.
Right. Okay.
So Goldratt's idea was that I would rewrite the book in the form of a novel.
Novel. Yeah, I like the novel.
He was really enamored of the novel approach to writing. And anyway, but he said, I want you to come on over and we'll talk about it. So I flew to Israel, and I figured, okay, I'm going to be in a hotel over there. But no, Goldratt and his daughter Efrat picked me up at the airport, and we drove to Goldratt's house. And he put me up in his son Rami's room for 4 nights. I stayed as a guest in his house for 4 nights. And it was an education all by itself. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I truly enjoyed meeting and talking with his wife, Betty. She was just the nicest lady. And believe it or not, I spent as much time with her as with him, because I was getting up at 7 o'clock, 7:30 in the morning, which is about when she'd get up. He was sleeping in until 1, 2, 3 in the afternoon and staying up until 4 in the morning. And I couldn't stay up that long. So I'd have about 6 or 7 hours with him, or maybe even 8. And then I'd go crash and he'd stay up a while longer. And then when I'd get up, I had a wonderful time. Betty took me on tours around that part of Israel, and it was really cool. Anyway, the long and short of it was, Goldratt and I had a discussion about trying to make a novel out of that technical textbook. And he was convinced that it would happen. And I said, I don't think it can be done it's going to take 2 or 3 volumes to do that. He said, we'll publish it in 2 or 3 volumes. I said, oh God, nobody's going to read this thing. Nobody's going to read this thing. And the long and the short of it was, it never ended up happening. But I did get the round trip ticket. My book would have gone to Larry Gadd to publish, because I knew nothing about publication. And here was an introduction to a guy that wanted it right away. I won't go into the reasons why that never happened, but what it did was it forced me to go out and try to break into the publishing business. And I did that, and I got 2 different publishers that wanted to publish the book. And so it turned out that that's basically how I got into it. I saw Goldratt a couple more times. Once in 1997 at the TOC conference in Denver, Colorado, and again in 2000. I want to say it was 2002 in Tampa, Florida. Might have been 2001. I don't remember. And I enjoyed my interactions with him at those times. But by 2002, I decided, not only am I going to focus exclusively on the logical thinking process, I had already made that decision, but I came to the realization that I was giving up too much of what I really enjoyed in the systems thinking and systems management community. So I was going to move away from specializing in TOC and TOC related stuff. And I was going to go into the whole business of systems thinking and systems management, with the primary tool of that being the logical thinking process.
Right. Yeah.
And that's basically how it morphed in. I realize that's a long-winded way of telling the story, but I will say this: my trip to Israel to visit with Goldratt was one of the highlights of my professional career. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I came to appreciate 2 things. Number one was Goldratt's intensity. He was a very intense person, but he also had a hell of a sense of humor too. So
yeah. I guess you're a lucky guy to have got to know him. Then you continued teaching this at the university for how long then? And and how did you I think for anyone who's gone through training in the logical thinking process, people will understand that it's not something that you just learn in a couple of hours. It takes a lot of brain power to master it. How did that work out with the students? Did you how many?
That's a really good question. The short answer is, I have learned during my consulting career that the application of the learning that I offered in the thinking process courses approximates the standard 80-20 ratio. 80% of the people who go through it will not follow through with it. They find it to be interesting. They may just dabble at it a little bit, but eventually they stop doing it. 20% will actually gravitate to it, grip it with a vengeance, and go on to apply it. So even though I'm teaching a class of 100%, I'm smart enough to realize I can't really get that percentage above 20. So I'm talking to the 20%. I'm trying to reach the 20%, even though I'm talking to the 100%.
Yeah.
And so there were quite a few students in the program that I taught that did carry on with it in the future thereafter. But unfortunately, the university, in its infinite ignorance, decided that it didn't really need a systems management program anymore. And in 1996, they phased the program out completely. And this, I thought, was the greatest mass stupidity in the Western world, because they had a lock on teaching systems management and could have promoted it. But the course was politically assassinated at the executive levels of the university, because it ran afoul of the business school, which was trying to sell MBAs, and the Master of Science in Systems Management was drawing potential students away from that, and they didn't like it, and they had more pull. So,
yeah, right. Yeah. So then you move into consulting after that, or was that?
Well, I was more or less forced to do that when I didn't have the university to lean on anymore in 1996. I said, well, it looks like I'm going to have to do something with this. And I had come to the realization that there were a lot of people and a lot of companies out there who not only didn't know anything about the logical thinking process, but they were woefully ignorant of systems thinking and systems management, which was my strong suit from having taught for 8 years in the program. So I said, okay, I'm going to start offering systems thinking with the basis of the logical thinking process. And TOC, critical chain, and drum buffer rope, the thinking process, et cetera, et cetera. These were all in their heyday at the time, maximum notoriety and maximum popularity. And so there was no shortage of companies that wanted to bring me in to teach them. And so I had that for quite a number of years until my own consulting practice got built up. So that's basically how I made that transition there. I was fortunate along the way. I really was.
Yeah, I guess you've been, you have, and it's really interesting how, to listen to how you get into this, and you stayed basically. You stayed with this focus ever since.
Yes.
And it's so you're coming into this. It's at the time. It's TOC is it's basically and always has been probably a fringe methodology in a way, though it got quite popular for a while. But then for some reason the popularity maybe has waned again.
Well, you're right. You're right about that. And I have to believe, in retrospect, I'm one of many people who have asked that question. Why hasn't it really caught on in a broad mainstream? And in retrospect, it's only in retrospect, I should say, that I've come to a conclusion. Whether it's correct or not, I'm not sure, but it's a conclusion that I've come to. And that is, when you get right down to the grassroots of the whole thing, for 20 years or more, Goldratt was selling the methodology of TOC. And that had a tendency to sound to people in business like the flavor of the month. And they lumped it all together with things like total quality management, Six Sigma, things like that.
Yeah.
To Toyota production managed system, or lean, that type of thing. And so basically they put it in that bailiwick, and it didn't have quite the visibility out of it that those others did. Okay. However, where I got my success was not trying to sell the methodology. You ought to use TOC as a method for running your company. That's what Goldratt's in his ultimate objective was. Mine was, you got a corporate problem that you don't know how to solve because you don't fully understand all the ramifications to it. Let me help you solve your problem. And I would go into the company and I would not try to sell the method or the tool or anything. I'd just use the tool, and I would show them what their issues were. And I did this with one company called Deloitte and TOC in 2010. We went in there, we didn't sell the methodology, we sold the analysis of the problem. And when we got to the bottom of the gold tree and we briefed the CEO and chairman of this $10 billion corporation, he looked at the gold tree and he said, I've been looking for that for 25 years.
Yeah.
And then when we showed him the current reality tree and where it went down to the few critical root causes at the bottom, he said, we'll take it. And they took it and they ran with it. Now, they didn't even follow through with the rest of the thinking process. They just said, we'll take this problem tree and we'll solve it our way. And they did.
Right. Yeah.
And they succeeded.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's
this is a subject that I think would be really interesting to discuss with you. And you have those trees still? You have copies of them?
Yes, I do. And in point of fact, they were non-disclosure trees for 5 years after having been done. I still feel we'll say an ethical commitment not to reveal all of the trees, the entire thing, but I will typically show how extensive the tree is, and I'll sometimes zero in on parts of it so that people can see it. But I'm even though the 5 years is gone and the organization has changed rather dramatically, I still feel a little bit of an ethical obligation to
of course,
protect their interest.
Yeah.
But yes, I have those trees. Maybe sometime if you want to do another one of these, I'll show you what it looks like. Yeah,
excellent. So I think this is thank you for this
well, it's my pleasure.
Sort of helicopter view of your process. I think this is something that I hope will be interesting for my audience and to know a bit about the background, because it's my goal with this new blog is to basically introduce the logical thinking process and get people to understand and to appreciate it and to use it, because it's this is my feeling that is very important and maybe more important now than ever to try and get people to apply critical thinking. And even though it's it may be a tedious process, can be sometimes to go through all this, and we haven't really touched upon the nuts and bolts in all of this, which is the rules of logic. But I guess we could do that at another time.
We could do that, yes.
Go through that, yeah.
And pursuant to that, let me mention something else, which I don't think you and I have ever discussed. My first two books, one was the Goldratt's Theory of Constraint. The other one was for another publisher, and it was called Breaking the Constraints to World-Class Performance. Now, both of those books are out of print now. But in the Breaking the Constraints to World-Class Performance, I built a chart in my research I discovered that there were many commonalities between the formal rules of logic and the categories of legitimate reservation that Goldratt uses to evaluate trees. So I asked myself, how do these things fit together? How do they compare? And so I actually built a chart that relates, it's a 2-column chart that relates all of the formal fallacies down the left side and all of the categories down the right side, and points across the line as to which ones, which of the categories of legitimate reservation relate to which of the formal fallacies. So believe it or not, the CLR have a definite, definable basis in the original Aristotelian logic.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And unfortunately, I don't have access to that here on the road, or I would send it to you right away. But I'll do that after I get home.
Yeah.
You're going to have to remind me, though.
I'm really excited about seeing that, and it's
Okay.
it's maybe something that might be worth publishing
Mhm.
on the blog.
I
But
think we
thank
could.
you very much, Bill.
You're
It's
most
been a
welcome.
pleasure, and take care, and we'll be speaking soon again.
Okay, thank you again,
Okay.
Thorsteinn. I look forward to it.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.